everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of Startups Dilse. I am excited to be joined by my friend from my B school here, Sabari Raja, and we're recording this on a Friday afternoon. So, Sabari, thanks so much for taking the time on a Friday afternoon before you get into the weekend to chat with me, talk about all the fun things you've done in your life, which I'm sure is going to be super useful for people listening and people watching. So welcome to the show, Sabari.
Thank you, Anthony. I appreciate the opportunity, and it's always nice to connect with an old friend.
Yeah, I must say, I probably learned more about you in the last few weeks of talking than I learned through the 2 years of MBA because you and I were in probably different batches at that time, different study groups. I mean, our paths probably crossed only on our trips to Chile and to China, right? But I'm so glad I know you better, and congratulations on all your success since B school. So the other thing I have to say is you're the second guest from Tamil Nadu. For those of for those who don't know, my first guest on the podcast was Vishnu Subramanian. He has a startup based in Coimbatore. And Sabari happens to be from the same state as I, which is in the southern part of India called Tamil Nadu. So I'm happy that in my first 10 episodes, I have two folks from my home state.
Not just from the home state. I'm also from near Coimbatore. Went to school in Coimbatore, so you must have some affinity towards Coimbatore.
What can I say? There's a lot of smart people from Coimbatore, I guess.
I have to agree, actually.
So maybe let's start with that, Sabari. Why don't you tell our folks here a little bit about where you come from, how did you come to the US? And where you are today, and then we'll obviously double click on each of them and get to know more about you.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm excited to share my story. So my background, just like most other people in our network, coming from South India, of course, if you get good grades, you're supposed to become an engineer or a doctor, and so I became an engineer. I did go to undergrad. I did go to undergrad in Coimbatore and Kumaraguru College of Technology, and then I grew up mostly in rural South India, right? Like most of my family is all into farming. My husband always jokes that why don't you tell people exactly where you're from, because you're not from Coimbatore, So I think I'm like, if people know the geography, depending on how much you know about that area, accordingly, I will keep moving my location of where I'm exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm actually from near Pollachi. Like my parents live on a farm on the border of Kerala and Tamil Nadu. So, for people who know Pollachi, I can give more details. It's further and it keeps going further and further down. Closer to the Western Ghats, it's a beautiful area. We wake up to hearing peacocks, and I always go back and wonder like why I left the place, So, but most of my family for generations have been farming. So my exposure was very limited, also, while my parents gave me a lot of opportunities, they themselves did not have college degrees, So for me, but there was always this push and aspiration to study and get good grades and do something and have a career. And so when I went to boarding school all my life because there was no schools around where I'm from, or at least no good schools. That was very common in my family. So I went to boarding school, did most of my schooling in Coimbatore, did my engineering degree there as well. So the long story short, I did the final year of engineering. There was, either you go start working or, you end up, at that time, there was a lot of, interest in doing your master's abroad. I didn't think my parents were going to let me leave. You know how it goes. I've never even left the state at that point. Probably the farthest I've gone is the neighboring state to Bangalore. I never even traveled past Bangalore at that point. So some of my friends were writing GRE, and I said, okay, well, I should also try. It sounds like so fabulous to go so far away and see the world. And that's really sort of set the thing in motion. I didn't think my parents were going to agree to this, but somehow I think they also got sucked into this, thing once the ball was in motion. And that was my biggest risk. My first biggest risk I've ever taken. And I had never even gotten on a plane up until that point. That was my first flight trip. Everything was new. Ended up at LSU for my master's in computer science. And people always ask me, how did you pick LSU of all schools? And literally at that time, used a Peterson's guide and picked only schools in the South that were cheap. And we were looking at how many books are in the library, and that's how clueless we were, like. so so basically, like, zero exposure, no idea what I was doing, and not much confidence, but there was always that inner push to try something, do something, take that next step, and get out of your comfort zone and take that risk and see what happens. There was always that inner motivation to continue doing that, even though I didn't have the confidence and the abilities at that point. So that led me to, I did my master's in LSU, and my first job from campus, I ended up at Texas Instruments in Dallas, and I happened to end up in their education technology. And I never even knew EdTech was a thing. EdTech really wasn't a big thing at that time. And that's where, even though I hadn't gone to K through 12 schools in the US, being at TI, working on products that went into classrooms, that's really how I first got exposed to education technology. And then sort of trying to think, what is next in my career? Then it became apparent I needed to sort of get a business degree. And that's how I ended up at SMU, where I met you. And you know the story for what happened in those 2 years. That really sort of opened up my network and opportunities and gave me the courage to take that first step towards entrepreneurship. My first idea was literally the idea that we pitched in school for an entrepreneurship class. We can talk a bit about that later. I don't want to go into all those details, but literally left my job, tried something, didn't work. I was like, okay, I need to try again. And then the company that I started, Nepris, in 2013 or 2014, mainly was using my lived experience, where I grew up on a farm, had zero exposure, zero social capital. But I was coming at it from, I have this technology background. I was shocked to see in the US that even oceans apart, like in this country also, many students didn't have access. I could sort of see myself in them. And rural school districts, underserved school districts, students didn't really have that exposure or access. And I got connected to a lot of different groups around the country, sort of talking about this problem and how do we solve it. And I felt like there were a lot of people, industry, government, education, everybody coming together talking about this, but technology wasn't playing a role in connecting the dots. So it was sort of that perfect moment, right, where I can relate to this problem because I myself have had the lived experience, and my work and background sort of brought me there. And I could sort of see this next generation of kids through that same lens. And clearly I saw a problem. And that's really what I set out to do. So started the company, grew the company, ended up getting acquired end of 2021, and then stayed on for a year to see it through a merger and a rebranding. And along the way, I really sort of built my personal brand in the industry, grew out of my, fears and, hesitations and imposter syndrome and all of that. Really found myself in this process and really got comfortable with who I was, what I was trying to do, and built a great network of people around me. And that is what led me to what I'm doing right now. One of my early investors reached out to me and said, hey, come join me to start a venture fund that's also investing in founders like yourself, that's balancing impact and scale and education and workforce. I was like, hey, I've been on the other side of the table. I've gone through that journey for 8 years. I'm always about learning new things and pushing myself out of my comfort zone. I never really intended to become a full-time investor, but here I am, been doing this for a year and a half.
So. Great story, Sabari. Whenever you write your book, I'll be sure to buy it.
As soon as I get some time, Anthony.
So let's, there's so much to unravel from what you said. First up, I know a little bit about EdTech, and I'm assuming people who are listening know the high levels of it as well. Maybe since you've been in this industry for a bit, Sabari, I tried to connect the dots between TI being TI more on the hardware side of things. At least that's what they're known for. made me wonder what were they doing on the EdTech side of things, right? So maybe
Yeah, yeah,
if you
yeah.
could talk a little bit about EdTech and maybe how it's evolved. And then that's what kind
Yeah.
of led you to also figure out saying, oh, here's a gap, and which gave you
Mm-hmm.
the idea for the startup. So can you
Mm-hmm.
educate us a little bit on EdTech itself and from where it was to probably where it is right now?
Yeah, no, no. I think that's a great question because I've had the privilege of seeing the edtech market grow and become a real industry,
Yeah.
right? Because when I started at TI, I'll probably date myself here like 20 plus years back. EdTech was the EdTech division at TI was called the calculator group. Like everybody knew the graphing calculators. That was education
Yeah.
technology, right? But then eventually, like software became a part of it. And then, like more and more beyond the hardware, software solutions started sort of, showing up in classrooms. And then I actually had an opportunity to work with a lot of publishers while I was at TI as well. So if you think about the large publishers, mostly for decades, they've been selling content in the form of printed
Yeah.
books where the opportunity, like really, I feel like this last 20 years we've seen drastic changes with technology in education because it then content then became sort of digital content, right? That was a tremendous opportunity. There was a whole slew of startups
Yeah.
that really sort of leveraged that transition, and everybody, like publishers who were very comfortable in printing books for many decades, had to change quickly. But then you saw some people go away and new entrants come in that was like sort of owning the digital content space.
Yeah.
So as we were seeing beyond the digital content, then the evolution in edtech then became, I think a lot of people in India can relate to this, like then it was more about tutoring and online, like as online as technology was evolving, where virtual connections became like a real possibility, bandwidth improved within technology, what was available to us, what you couldn't imagine, like 10 years before that you could do now, like you could actually have a live conversation online even in the early stages. Then you saw like a dearth of tutoring platforms come out,
Yeah.
right? So you saw some big players really sort of become unicorns in this space. So education technology sort of evolved from like digital content, then it became connections, virtual connections. Then for a while it was like you have like the smart boards in the classroom. Like once you have certain different types of hardware, like we went from what are those things where you put those plastic sheets on transparent
Yeah. Yeah.
things, and
I know what it is.
from there it went yeah, you know what I mean, right? So from there it went to like every classroom had a smart board, and then like now you have the smart boards, like then you have the digital content that goes on the smart boards. Then you have other technologies and tools that are starting to think about interactive learning, um, you know, um, adaptive learning, and then everything sort of digital content became sort of in the form of assessments. And so edtech has sort of, I've had the pleasure of seeing edtech evolve from this print textbook to a lot of different technologies, where now the problem is like the opposite. There is like thousands of technology and tools in a school district that they're not even sure how to navigate all of that,
Yeah.
right? So when I started looking at this industry, like literally Zoom had just started, like the company Zoom had just started, and that was a game changer because we were sort of going to that next level of video conferencing becoming such a day-to-day tool, and we leveraged that in order to build our platform. So the problem that we set out to solve was, there was so much content, there was so much curriculum, but we were still like, there was such a big gap between classroom learning and what was happening in the real world.
Yeah.
So when we started building, we were seeing a lot of career and technical education conversations. Like, okay, now, going beyond the math and the reading and saying, how are we actually preparing students for the future of work? How is this actually applying in the real world? And that was the problem we set out to solve. We said employers are left out of this conversation. Education is here, employers are here. There is a big gap in between. how can then we leverage all of these new technologies to really connect the dots? That's really what Nepris was.
That's great. I mean, my mind was still in the transparencies that you were talking about.
Yeah, the transparencies, yes.
Yeah, so I still remember going
Yeah,
to NIIT in Chennai, and I used to give presentations in transparency. So those were the days. But
yeah,
we've come
yeah,
we've come a
yeah.
long way for sure. So
Correct, correct.
the one of the last things you mentioned about, the industry connection from what you learn in school to how it is applicable in real life. How is it going to make a
Yeah.
difference for that student coming out of the classroom, right? How do you measure success for that, Sabri, in the model? I mean, was there a metric that you had to say, okay, we are bridging the gap, and here's what success means if we do X, Y, and Z as part of Nepris?
Yeah, no, that is actually at the heart of every education technology company, right? Like every edtech company to some extent is an impact focused
Yeah,
company because you're trying to move the needle and outcomes within education. This is a question that we today, even till today, we battle with because depending on the type of solution you're developing, it's not a easy answer to that, like for example, if I was developing something for college students which was going to help them find a job right out of college, right, then I can easily measure my outcomes and say, okay, 80% of the students that have used my platform have landed a job within the first 3 months or whatever, after graduation.
yeah,
But what we were trying to do was one of the hardest things to do is we were saying, even sometimes like when students come to high school, it's a bit too late. This exposure needs to be embedded into the day to day learning. It's not something that happens once a year during career day. They need to be, if you're learning about rocks in second grade, you need to be talking to a
yeah,
geologist. So it was a very much like a I'm going to change the world kind of, idea where we were trying to move mountains. We were trying to change teacher behavior in the classroom of how they teach. We're trying to bring external industry people virtually into the classroom to teach along, not really teach, but bring relevance to what students are learning. So when you're trying to actually change the way second graders learn, measuring that outcome of, okay, did this kid who actually talked to a geologist become a geologist? I mean, it's very hard. Like you're in second grade, so it's very hard to measure sort of that outcomes and efficacy because you're going like way down in the grade level because we believe that it needs to start there,
yeah.
right? And it was always hard to sort of,
Measure that.
as an impact focused company, measure that. So we worked on like intermediate measurements. Like we said, is the student more engaged in the classroom? Did they understand the concept better? Did they learn about a career that they never knew before? So we worked with some third party, universities and other researchers to come up with sort of intermediate measurements. And then as they move into middle school, thinking about, did this actually influence how you take your electives in your high school? Like now, because you spoke with an accountant, even if they say I don't ever want to do accounting, that's a win.
Yeah,
So because a lot of times a vast number of kids actually drop out of first year or change their majors in the first year. So even that was a win. So we had to get creative about how to measure intermediate successes because the ultimate goal of measuring going into a job was very sort of far
yeah,
away,
yeah.
right?
It's a hit or a miss sort of a measurement. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, eventually, like once then they're like in middle school, they're making choices about what high school electives to take, and that was an indication of their interest. So there were points along the way we were trying to measure these things, but it was not straightforward. So.
yeah. It's awesome what you did with Nepris because I mean, a lot of times, I mean, when kids are in middle school, when my daughter's in middle school, and we randomly ask a question to her saying, "What do you want to become? Where's your head at? That sort of thing." A lot
Yeah,
of times, I mean, obviously they have their interests, but it's also kind of influenced by what their friends want to do at times, which is
yeah,
which
yeah,
is
yeah, yeah,
which is funny, right? But
yeah,
I mean, I've seen at least maybe in 50% of the cases. I mean, if a kid is interested in something when they were 5 or 10 and they have a passion for it, I mean, eventually they'll
yeah,
be doing something related to it. I mean, it's up to the parents, up
yeah,
to the teachers to find that, nurture that, and give them the
Yeah.
pathway to take off, right? I mean, so I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that's what you're doing. So that's very commendable. The
No, thank
so
you.
the Let's go back a little bit. I mean, obviously you had a great exit with all things worked out with Nepris, but let's
Yeah.
probably go back to maybe 2011, 2012, I guess. Sabri, is that when you really wanted to come out of TI and wanted to be an entrepreneur?
Yeah. Yeah. 2012, I think. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what made you actually want to take that risk? I mean, you had um, I mean, I'm assuming, TI was a stable job and you were having
Yeah.
fun there. But I mean, what really
Yeah.
forced you to think on the lines of saying, hey, I feel a need, I see a gap in the system there, and I think I can
Yeah.
build a company off of it? I mean, how did you get to that
Yeah.
realization?
Yeah, no, to some extent, it's not knowing what it takes to build a company. Like I think it's the same reason why I just decided to come to the US to do my master's at the time, given where I came from, right? It's always, there was always that sort of what's next. And I was always had that intrinsic motivation to do stuff, but one thing around that time, it was a great place to really sort of grow in your career. They give you a lot of flexibility. You have a lot of options to move around and try different things. I was really sort of doing well, sort of growing up in my career within TI, and I could have easily sort of said, okay, this is, be content with that. But I think it's kind of a disease, like you're like, okay, I want to do more. So I think the combination of that with my MBA, and then at that time, I actually took an emerging market opportunity with TI, and I actually moved to India for 8 months. I had two little kids at that time. So I ended up moving to India really to sort of evaluate the India education technology market. I had a lot of opportunities to work at all levels with the Ministry of Education to NCRT and all of those, and sort of evaluate. That was more like an entrepreneurship, right? Like
Yeah.
I was alone in this country trying to understand the market, build a business case, put a budget together, put a team together, convince like the higher ups that there is an opportunity here. Got to do all of that, but then when it was time to sort of execute it, there was some, like, I forget what the reason was. For some reason where they decided to sort of stop all emerging market projects or something like that happened. And that was like a setback for me. I was like, put so much effort into it. And then always internally, I was always like, I'll see a problem even within the company, and I'm like, I'm going to put together a proposal, I'm going to present it to so and so. But in a large company, sometimes, there's a lot of politics, and people are not always open to, young, like, people coming and presenting random ideas, because people have been there, leaders have been there for decades, and they're sort of set in their ways, and you can't really move the needle that fast within a large organization.
Yeah.
Even if there are good people. And that was, though, like, I tried to do that a couple of times and I got a lot of pushback, and that was frustrating to me, So when the MBA happened and we had put together a business plan and thought this idea could actually be something. And I had to have a conversation with my husband at the time, because I didn't start the company in my early 20s, right? Like I had two little kids, we had a house, a mortgage, a certain lifestyle that we were a comfortable two-income earning family in the US. And so if I have to go try something, it means like for years, I'm not going to be able to get this pay. So I needed to have that conversation first. And for me, my biggest cheerleader like has always been my husband, and he was like, of course, go for it, right? So having that support at home was also super helpful. I can't imagine if I had to fight my battles at the house, I don't know if I could have done, so it sort of felt like everything sort of lined up, and I ended up starting the first company that was completely about something completely different. It was still education technology, but it was about how to use gaming to help students learn and understand math concepts better. So spent a year trying to get that off the ground. And it took me a year to realize, like, one thing is starting the company with someone who has the same risk tolerance as you, like I had already had this critical conversation with my husband. I said, forget about half of our salaries. It's not going to come. Are we going to be okay? But I ended up partnering with someone who probably was a single learning member in their family. They couldn't take the same level of risk. And that they hadn't had those, critical conversations. Like, you can't raise friends and family funding and pay yourselves $10,000 a month. You have to go without taking a pay until you get your MVP, get the product out in the market, raise some. Even when you raise seed funding, no founder is paying themselves market rate salary. So that was my first big lessons learned, is if I'm partnering with someone, I need to make sure that both of us are able to take the same level of risk. There were other issues with that product, even though it was a very it was a very interesting, solution. The ability to actually develop sort of game-based content for a full, subject, it's very capital intensive. I didn't think of all those things upfront. As a first-time entrepreneur, you're like, oh, I love this idea, I'm going to go change the world, right?
Was that an EdTech as well?
Yeah, that was also EdTech. It's basically, EdTech is helping students learn math through game-based learning. So, and that basically what we realized was, one was, like both the founders sort of didn't have the same risk profile, right? The other person wasn't able to go for too long without taking a full salary. That was that's a big barrier. And then next is the product itself was very ambitious and lofty. And as first-time entrepreneurs, we just couldn't go raise money to build the product. We had to build the product before money came. So it's a cart before the horse, right? Like, so we couldn't really build. We could maybe build one problem, right? But then how are you going to sell like one problem to a school? In order to sell something to a school district, you need to have some volume of content, and then by the time we realized all this and calculated the costs of doing this, we were not going to be able to take it off the ground. So we had to pull the plug within a year, and that was devastating because I had left a perfectly good job to start this company, and it failed badly very soon, right? But now that I look back, a lot of those lessons learned were super valuable. As painful as it was, as painful as it was, we didn't even put legal docs in place. We took friends and family money. I eventually paid it off, but because I'm like, I still need to be invited to family dinners, right? But it was so stressful. The fact that I took friends and family money and this never went anywhere. There's nothing to show. But I reached out to a lot of people at the time to ask for feedback and help. And I kind of got into a rut. Like, I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? I was just sitting at home doing nothing. And I started interviewing thinking, okay, I'll just go back to work. But I wasn't really like in any sort of hurry. It was very quickly I was getting into that, like, oh yeah, I'll like wake up late and just hang around the house. And, it's so quick how you go from I'm motivated to build a company to I'm not going to do anything for a while,
Yeah.
And so that actually, one of my friends reached out to me. It was 3 months into that. I was interviewing here and there, but nothing like, I had a great offer. I hadn't taken it. I was still thinking. I gave myself 2 years to start a company. Maybe I need to think about it a bit. And then one of my friends had reached out and said, hey, there's a STEM education event going on in Richardson. You should go attend. Really right up your alley. And that was the point that changed. I even at that time, I was like, I don't know if I want, it's already too late. I don't know if I want to get ready and go. And I actually finally went, and I'm glad I did, because I actually walked in late, and I like, when you walk in late, like the worst thing that can happen is that somebody who's like up there talking stops talking and says, oh, you there who just walked in, come over here and
take the front row seat.
And take the front row seat, right? Literally, I'm not even making this up, because I sit in that, I make my walk of shame and I go sit in that front row seat. And then in that table was Kent, who was like the general manager for TIDLP, which was a different business unit. Sam, who was with the Irving ISD. His wife, I think, was a CTO of Irving ISD, and he was also working there. Pam, who was a teacher at McKinney ISD, a career and technical education teacher. She was teaching principles of engineering. These were my table mates that I was, made to sit. And long story short, that event, I was in that room for the whole day. There were industry leaders, government, education leaders, everybody talking about, there's not enough kids coming out of this pipeline, having the skills to take the jobs. Like, what are we doing to bridge this gap in education?
Yeah.
And that was evident to me. Like, there was a lot of people there was companies, like company leaders from Intel, General Motors, Raytheon, Lockheed, all the local school districts, the chamber, the economic development, you name it, like everybody was there, right? And you have a nice happy hour at the end of the day. Everybody is really motivated. They have good intentions. But what I saw was like technology wasn't playing a role in connecting the dots, right? And so the same night I drove to my friend's house, who then became the co-founder and CTO of Nepris. We were throwing stickies up on the wall at 11 o'clock. His first thing was, I'm sure that somebody's has a platform where they're connecting industry and education. There were a lot of mentoring platforms, but not like how we were envisioning. We're saying, if you're learning about solar power, you should be connecting with a renewable energy expert. It wasn't going at that level.
Yeah.
So that was really like, there was a clear problem. I was there, and it was being at the right place at the right time, but also listening and seeing what the problem is. And then I got super excited about this. I'm like, we did some, analysis, and there's really not like an apples to apples competition. And to some extent, like, this college and career readiness and career exposure was just, these discussions were just starting to happen in EdTech, right? And Zoom was just founded. And so it's sort of everything came together.
Yeah.
It's nice coming together, right? It's like, and it was not easy, because it's not easy to build a product that requires teachers to change their behavior. It took, you should have seen my very first 5-year financial model. It was beautiful, but then it took, it took much longer to get there.
That concludes part 1 of today's episode with Sabari Raja. Tune in next week for part 2. Hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for tuning in.